All right, Mike and Barclay, welcome to the show. We have a potentially nerdy conversation tonight, but potentially interesting as well. I mean, there's clearly a lot of conversation about season structure, points allocations, game spots, distributions, and has been for a couple years now. I would say that a few years ago, I was the go-to resource for things like this, and now I'm going to you guys for something like this. So tables have turned a little bit as the sports continue to evolve, and more or less, these guys are people that I've known for a while, and they're really good at this. They're better at this than I am, and so a lot of the work that I do preparing for competitions is much more efficiently done by them, and they stay up to date with this kind of stuff very, very well. So if you're not familiar with Mike Halpin, the Instagram account that you want to follow for this information is known and knowable. And Barclay Dale has got his Instagram down there very cleverly, his first name and his last name. I would say, I don't know, over the last couple of years that in some role or another, the three of us have worked at high-level broadcasts and the back end of the production, helping with producers, directors, and talent, people that you see on the screen, giving them information that can help frame stories, contexts, and give information about athletes. This year at semifinals, Barclay was the only one of us to have done that. So Barclay was working very closely with Lauren Khalil and Adrian Conway in the West Coast Classic, and then with Sean Woodland and Adrian at Syndicate Crown. Barclay, general sentiments, feedback after doing that for 2 weeks this year at the semifinal from a perspective that very few people get to have?
It was cool to see like how the sausage is made, like the back end of everything. It's like you're not really there to spectate and like by any means at all. You're there with a job of pointing people out on the floor that are doing something that is not being caught by other people and drawing the viewer's attention to that area. Having a headset on and having someone talk in my ear while someone else is talking right in front of me and having to listen to both at the same time is definitely something I had to work through. I was definitely better the second weekend than I was the first weekend. But that doesn't make the first weekend a bad experience by any means. So it was very cool, very new. 10 out of 10 would recommend, but get ready to be overwhelmed for the first 10 heats that you do.
Yeah, that is probably the element of broadcasting that I know I have the least experience with in terms of doing it. And it's something that I have tremendous appreciation for, especially if you listen to broadcasts that Sean Woodland does. The guy does not miss a beat, despite the fact that there's constant information being given to him while he's trying to give you the best information that he can about what's happening on the floor. If you listen closely and if you're familiar with this thing, and you watch through the 3 heats or 3 weekends of semifinals, you'll notice a difference in how people handle changing of information when they have to project it out. And it just comes down to experience, like Barclay said. It takes some getting used to, because it's easy to have a stream of thought when your thoughts are the only thing you hear. And it's really hard to do that when you have someone else's stream of thought in your ear for a majority of the time that you're talking. So glad that you got to experience that a little bit. And Mike, you took kind of 2 initiatives this year for semifinals that I would say were new for you. The first was highlighting all 280 men and women who qualified for semifinals on your stories over 3 weeks with relevant competition performance, their ranking in the region, worldwide, and a live kind of a insight into some kind of movement or combination of talking and movement that they were doing. Will we be seeing more of this in the future?
I don't think I will try to cover 280 men and women again. Like that. It was, if you want to get blocked on Instagram basically from doing anything, try to post 200 stories in like a week and then see what happens. I've been seeing comments that I have background noise. I'm actually in the Great Smoky Mountains, just for telling everybody in the chat. And my cabin has zero Wi-Fi, so I'm currently sitting in a Starbucks, and it got a little more crowded since I got here. So I will try to put myself on mute if I'm not directly talking. But back to semifinal stuff, since we're still talking about that. Yeah, I think it went really well. Trying to find like an avenue for some of the stuff that we have. I worked up a good bit. Barclay gave me quite a bit of background information on a lot of the athletes as well. Trying to get that out there so it's not the same 5 or 10 people that everybody talked about. Obviously, we had some shakeups this year in semifinals and who got to the game, so it did help a little bit to know some of these rookies, know some of the new names, as well as some of the smaller areas like South America or Africa or Asia, where like you're going to hear some names talked about on a broadcast and have no idea who they are because they're not Guy and they're not Sung Young Choi and they're not folks like that. So yeah, I think it helps out some good flavor there.
And then secondarily, for the Syndicate Crown, you actually had a media presence on site. You hired our good friend Sebs from Iron and Castle, and had him there taking some photos primarily of one of the best semifinals we've ever seen, and using some of that content out as a product of that. You produced a bunch of good stuff and obviously relevant pictures to go with some of the stories you're telling. But also that post you put up about the coaches, which had received a ton of positive feedback. I was curious if you could give us insight into the inspiration for that.
Well, part of the inspiration, I mean, all great artists steal, I think, is a quote that I still also steal from somebody else. I saw Draw Your Dagger. He's in the comments here. He was doing quite a bit like behind the scenes of the media folks, the coaches, people like that. So I grabbed a little bit from that. I told Sebastian, can you take pictures of all these coaches? And I sent him some basically creepy Instagram stalking of like who these guys were, to be honest with you. And he grabbed some amazing photos of these coaches. And then it just hit me the next morning of like how much these coaches have gone through over just even the last 3 weeks. I think, Brian, you were telling me that I think you're one of maybe a handful of people that actually went to all 3 major semifinals. And then, just reflecting on just like even me sitting at home or what Barclay did over the last couple of weeks and what I did last year similarly, like just how much you go through just to that. And just to say like, hey, if it didn't even go the way of the athlete that you might've been coaching, things like that, like you still got them there. And like, just a big, like sort of exhale when it came to all that. So yeah, I wrote that thing. It got way more press than I thought. I was really just trying to highlight some great coaches and friends out of that. But yeah, it went really well.
It absolutely did. And just, congratulations to both you guys. It's even just seeing the comments here, it's pretty clear that your contributions are starting to be recognized and noticed. Since the semifinals has happened, we've had some news come out regarding these different kind of ranking systems or updates to ranking systems, which, it's for some people, it's maybe not that interesting, but for other people, it's really interesting because it's an establishment of something that we can use to project or tell patterns, stories, trends over time, and to have an understanding of how this season will evolve and where the athletes that ultimately make it to the final goal, which is to compete at the CrossFit Games, will come from, or to compete on the biggest stages will come from, in the case of the Rogue Invitational. So last week I was more or less out of pocket. I was just trying to detach from, a CrossFit season and year that I'm involved in so heavily almost every day. And of course, there's always things going on. So I asked these guys to come here tonight to basically walk me through the changes that happened the last week. They've been staying up to date with it. They've each put out some content that's available, which we'll show you guys tonight as well, but you can also explore in your own regard in the places they've posted them. And I think we'll start with maybe the what I think is a little bit more simple because it's more familiar first, which is the update to the CrossFit worldwide ranking system. So just Halpin, maybe in like 2 minutes, can you just give us a background, bring us up to date of where we are with that before this announcement last week?
Yeah, sure. So CrossFit, I think, announced this back in 2020, to, or at least it was used for the 2023 season, and their ranking system ranks every athlete that does the individual quarterfinals, which is like at this point tens of thousands. John Young and folks like that are in there. And then really all of that ranking is to find the top 100 that show up for the men and the top 100 women. Look at what region they're in, and then allocate spots for the games, which I think there's been a lot of conversation about over the last few weeks, especially when it comes to those cut lines. Allocate those spots to the games each season. And in that case, it has a 2-year look back period. I know we're going to do some comparisons in a bit, but it has a two-year look back period, and it scores athletes based on how they did only in CrossFit events, obviously. And then we'll compare that to Rogue, I'm sure. But yeah, that's the pitch for us. Yeah.
And then there was one nuance that changed right just prior to semifinals this year. 7 or 8 days prior to that, they announced that the field that would be used for this year's allocation spots were only athletes that were competing in the season as an individual. Am I saying that correctly, guys?
You are. I don't know how Brian Spin does it over there, but he somehow gets Adrian Bosman to come on and say things that are not written down anywhere else. So they did announce on that podcast that only who I was doing all those Instagram stories about, only the 280 men and the 280 women that actually were in the semifinals were included in that review.
And therefore, it affects a depth of field that we know exists in certain regions. Just like when we see cross semifinal leaderboards and we see that there are athletes from specific regions around the world that would place in the top 40 or place well ahead of qualifiers from other regions in the quarterfinals, those tens of thousands of now participants that Mike was referencing to, a big density of them that could be in the top 100 or near the top 100 from other regions are eliminated. The maximum number of athletes that even in a totally lopsided system you could have in the top 100 from any region at this point is 40. And prior to that, there were some regions that were pushing into the 30s because of the depth that they had in their field. Where it's been said that he had no idea what he was going to announce that. Yes. And anyway, so it made a slight change, but Mike's been really at the forefront of explaining this to people, that 1 or 2 athletes can change a spot within that top 100. And as a result of that, we did see some changes to games allocation spots this year. Thoughts?
I agree. I mean, the fact that we've got a lot of people that were waiting to see how many spots the Europeans would get, and then to see them just kind of give those spots to other regions, not give, according to their system, they were earned spots. But based off of, let's say, tribal knowledge, what we can see just on paper is we'd expect the Europeans at least to get more and more spots based off of their performance in the system, and they just didn't get that. So it did make a huge difference for sure.
There's pros and cons to how those things were distributed that have been talked about, but generally speaking, the regions that we know from past studies have that depth of athletes, which is primarily North America, East, and Europe, lost one spot each, more or less, to regions around the world who have less qualifying spots to begin with. Mike?
Yeah, and the spots that they went to is sort of interesting too. It's Oceania got a spot each for the men and the women. There's been years of talking, especially you, Brian, about how at some points Oceania was always sort of one spot extra of us actually knowing anybody besides Tia, Carr, and Jamie. All 3 of those athletes are not there, and now we saw 4. I mean, we saw some repeats, obviously, but we saw 4 new athletes, more or less, in the last few years that are now getting to shine a little bit more. But it feels a little bit like a year too late, 2 years too late to say, like, okay, well, we never actually got to see maybe who was going to be that 4th athlete, and now we see like the Gracie Waltons and folks like that, Maddie Sturt, who did have to maybe suffer through those years, getting to shine a little bit more down there. And so it is interesting that with any of these look back periods of how actually that works and who it recognizes the most.
And so on the heels of all of that, CrossFit put this this kind of their new worldwide ranking system out. And there was, as a product of that, there was a nuance that I don't think, I wasn't really thinking about it in the context of when it was announced last year. I don't know how much they were thinking about it or not, but the number of people participating in quarterfinals last year affected the points distributions for the athletes that were there. And we had two different options. Basically, you either had 30 or 60 individual athletes at the semifinal stage last year in each competitive region. This year, that was 40 across the board. And so that variable changed on both ends. 30 went up to 40, 60 came down to 40, and it unified it. And then there's a secondary variable that we knew would change every year, which is the number of spots being allocated and how the points in those spots would be different. So this isn't really something new. Both of those numbers were relevant in the past. It's just that one of the variables, the number of participants, changed for everyone coming into this season. And so this points chart, which obviously looks very confusing on paper, but Mike, I think, can explain it quite simply here for us, hopefully. That did cause change across the board. So Mike, when this came out, were you surprised? What did you see? What did you learn?
Yeah, so the basics of this is if you win your semifinal, you get 4,000 points. So the max for any semifinal is 4,000 points. It then falls either slowly or dramatically, depending on how many game spots are at that semifinal. And especially now with only 40 spots at every semifinal, they fall a little bit more or less the same as you get to the higher side, and then much more quickly as you get to the lower side. So like Africa with only one spot, they're really only crediting the top maybe 5 in comparison to like North America East that had 11, where everybody within the top 10 is getting thousands of points, or even down to the top 20 is getting thousands of points.
And I think that you actually pulled attention to specifically the number 11, which because that was the lowest qualifying spot in some regions. And so I don't know if I can highlight this row here or whatever, but basically at the minimum, when you're having 1 or 2 qualifiers, if you finish 11th, which is 10 or 9 spots away from a qualifying spot, you get 165 points. And in the same finishing position in a region that does qualify that, you get 10 times the points, 1,000, or is it 10 times? 1,650. Yeah, 10 times the points.
Yeah, exactly. So you get 10 times. So when you do a worldwide ranking and you're trying to then compare the different regions, if you give one region, I'm not saying they shouldn't do this. I mean, the NA East was the best semifinal of all time. Africa was Africa, no offense. But like, I'm not going to try to compare the 11th person in Africa to the 11th person in North America East, or even the 12th that was right on that cut line that we all saw. What it does though, it creates a product of its own sort of making. Is that, well, if you give a whole bunch of points to those regions, what is the ranking going to do there? So that's really when it comes down to some of this. It's like, I know, again, we'll talk about Brian Spinn. He has a lot of stuff he's put out over the years on this. Like, he put out an article, and I think he even had Dave Eubanks or somebody on to address it at the time, was Africa actually can't do much. And I think they fixed that a little bit, honestly, but they can't actually do much because there's no points to achieve within the process. Everybody gets the same from open and quarterfinals. They get very little when it comes to the semifinals, and they only get really one athlete for the games. They could potentially get much, and in some of these smaller regions, their games finishes aren't the greatest. So when you start to do some of this, again, it just creates this product that is, well, of course, the top 100 is going to be very heavy Europe and North America, because not only do they have the best athletes, obviously, and that's where the points should go. I'm not arguing otherwise, but not only that, but the points are just going to go towards those, and it's just going to be this sort of self-fulfilling process.
And one of the things that you mentioned, or we mentioned earlier, was that there was a reallocation of some spots. And so in Africa's case, they didn't get any extra spots this year, but in some of the other ones, as you mentioned, they did get an extra spot to increase it to 2, 3, or 4. I think 3 or 4 spots. Because of that, there are but there are more points all the way down the line. If you look at this table here, you can see that if you had 2 and then you get 3, suddenly that second person gets an additional 1,000 points. The third person gets an additional 1,000 points. Same for fourth, 600 extra for 5, 300 for 6, 200, 190, etc. And it keeps going down. These extra points that you're inserting into some of these smaller regions, how much of an impact will that play on their ability to get even more points down the line, especially considering one of the other things you said, which is, some athletes aren't competing there this year in some of those places, which means new athletes are getting points, and having more athletes with more points in those regions is generally considered better. I don't know if Barclay, Mike, whoever.
He was on a roll, so I was going to give it to him.
I'm dealing with some outside forces at the moment. I'll just say it. There was no one in this Starbucks 2 minutes before this show started, and now this is a public area. I can't be offended by anybody being here, but there is a lot of people and a lot of things going on right now. So I think I got most of your question. Give it to me again in maybe a short version. I'll try my best.
Barclay, can you answer this one?
The question is, how does the point allocation changes impact the future of this worldwide rating system? And for me, it doesn't change much at all, because the limitations of it still exist in terms of where the big points are made. The big points are made at the top in the semifinals, and the big points are made at attending the games. And if you guys saw me in here 5 minutes ago, it's because I was looking at the breakdown of the games points specifically. And here's one thing that really annoys me about this point system, and it obviously annoys me because I've taken the past 6-8 months developing my own strength of field rating system. And so the things that annoy me are things that I've obviously implemented into mine. And I have an even distribution of points for every single place. So the difference in points from first to second is the same from second to third, as an example. However, if you look at the games points on CrossFit system, first to second is 3,000 points difference. That is the exact same distribution as 7th to 40th place. That doesn't really make much sense to me. I get rewarding. I get the concept of rewarding the winner more, but I don't like it. And I think that I don't like it because if someone goes to a competition that is not as strong, then they'll get rewarded more relative to the competition than someone in a harder field, which is still not resolved in this semifinals points allocation, because first place in Africa is equal to first place in North America East, is equal to insert any other region that you'd like. They're all 4,000 points. The only benefit comes from second through etc. place, because everyone still gets 4,000 points. So what you're saying is second place in 11 places for NA East. Second place in NA East was 3,750 points, and second place in Oceania was 3,300 points. So an extra 450 points was given to Dallin Pepper than was given to Bailey Martin. Yes. However, Jeff Adler was given the same number of points as Ricky Garrard. Mic drop.
Great example, very relevant, and obviously also athletes that we know have top 10 potential.
Yep.
The top 3 guys in North America East and the top 3 guys in Oceania. We have reason to believe that that's not out of the realm of possibility for them based on their performances and relative performances against similar athletes of that caliber. So great, I think great example there. So that's probably the one that's more familiar to people, is this worldwide ranking, because it's been around for a couple of years, as Mike explained for us, and just some small nuanced changes to a system that is kind of in this hybrid state where, Adrian Bosman has talked about letting it run its course or marinate over a couple seasons, but there was a minor change to it prior to semifinals that was self-inflicted, There was a minor change to it as a result of a previous change, the number of people competing there. And then there's also this variable for the number of qualifying spots. So that puts some stuff into context for worldwide ranking system, hopefully. A brand new thing was also announced this past week. And I wouldn't say I was surprised necessarily to see it, but I was quite curious about it and haven't had a chance to really delve into it yet, which is one of the reasons why we have these guys here tonight. Mike did do a little breakdown here on his Instagram account of the Rogue announcement that they made last week, which, you know, he's calling it the Invitational Qualifying System, or that's what they called it, and it's in a beta version.
Is it though?
Yeah, they call it a beta. They call it a beta like 1,000 times. I think just to be able to like keep a straight face on some of the stuff, because there are things that they put out there that I think Barclay has pointed out. We've had a conversation about. There's stuff on there that's just sort of like, okay, well that just is a typo or has to be wrong or whatever it might be. Like so where I'll say, and this will be true for a lot of the conversation, Rogue is trying to be, as best they can, very transparent about the process. They're calling it a beta. They're trying not to say that it's like how exactly it'll be used yet. They're like, if you're on the tech side, I work for a tech company. They have like change logs that basically say like, here's everything we're planning to change. Here's what we're working on at the moment, stuff like that. So they're trying to be very transparent. Flip side of that, the only other one, the one we just talked about, they announced a change on Spin's podcast. No, love Spin's podcast, watch it every week. But they announced a change on there. That's never been written down anywhere. They never actually said that when it came to announcing the spots or the leaderboard or rankings itself, things like that. And they just seemingly made that change on a whim as far as publicly how they've announced it. So that's where I do give them some credit, calling it a beta, as Barclay maybe was going to go into. And I'll let him do that. Once you announce something and put it out there publicly, it's hard to call it a beta anymore.
Brian, read the second bullet point on the screen.
The second bullet point.
Yep.
Down here, historically.
Yep.
Historically, we have selected a minimum of 10 athletes using this method.
Why is that contradictory to the fact that it's a beta system?
It's, from my understanding, you would probably call the what they refer to here as this method that they've been selecting a minimum of 10 athletes by using over the past history, whatever that is referring to. That would be the beta, and this would be rolling it out after the beta testing.
Yep. So either they've used it historically, and this is not a beta, or they have not used this historically, and this is a beta. Maybe it can happen, but to me, it doesn't make sense. It can't exist that. Thank you, Jory Dagger. But it can't exist that you have historically used a method, and it's been in a beta for 6 years, or however long. 6 years. 6 years.
This would be their 6th year.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense.
All right. So first of all, Patrick, welcome. Glad you could join us. Sorry for all the traffic again today. And here we go.
Yeah,
Rogue Invitational article. And it says this qualifying system accounts for current competition year and looks back an additional 5 years, notable and different to the system we were previously looking at from CrossFit and actually Barclay's system that he recognized for strength of field ratings, which are both using 2-year look backs. Barclay's was more basically modeled over the fact that that's what CrossFit uses.
Yep.
5-year look back to calculate an athlete's point total. The points earned in each preceding year are depreciated in weight. Barclay, correct me if I'm wrong, but that also applies to the system that you have, correct?
Correct, but not even distribution as they've done, where it's 1/6 less every single year back.
Okay, so there is a depreciation, but it's
same but different.
Yep. Athletes will gain points and have points fall off the total throughout the year after each of these events have been finalized. The Open, the quarterfinals, the games, and the Invitational of Rogue Invitational. Immediate thoughts, Barclay, about the choice of the included events?
I think they're playing it safe. I understand if we assume that they're not including semifinals because they don't want to deal with the strength of field of the various semifinals, then it makes complete sense that they would just ignore it and omit it. I'm fine with that for that reason. However, I think that it should be included, but it should only be included if that strength of field and therefore the point allocation is done correctly. What is correct look like? That remains to be seen. It's subjective. It can't really be objective. But they should include it. I understand why they have yet to include it if they ever decide to include it.
Patrick, have you taken over the back end?
Oh, I guess I did, didn't I? Do you want me to switch back?
No, that's totally fine.
I think it's a good visual. Yeah.
I would rather have you doing whatever you're doing than me trying to handle everything. So if you're taking over, good.
Yeah.
Keep going. Do your thing.
So to what Barclay was talking about there, without including semifinals, I think you even see this. I know Barclay's put it out. A couple people have put it out. The cross semifinal. I did it last year. The cross semifinal review. If you go down that path, you have to be very, maybe either you just say like, hey, well, here's all 6 events. They all did them. The run was obviously different in Asia than it was in California or it was in Knoxville. But here it is for everybody. That's what you do when you do the cross semifinal comparison. Same thing here. If you then try to put Laura Horvath and Tia Toomey next to each other, they ran 2 different runs, let alone they competed against 2 different fields, and then they needed to only beat those fields. So if you put them next to each other, and that's what we were just looking at with the points review for the semifinals on the CrossFit side, if you put them next to each other, then it already becomes like, well, somebody's getting more points than the other person, even if they both won their semifinals, even if they both won every event, honestly. You'd still have to put some asterisks next to it. So to get out of that by just saying, hey, we're just going to skip it entirely. By skipping it entirely, though, you take a lot of maybe heart out of it, because that is, I think the semifinals is truly the most honest live event of the entire season. And that includes the games, and that includes the Rogue Invitational. Rogue Invitational is an invitational. So that means you're invited to be there. You win some money if you win the whole thing. But if you come in 18th place and are just sort of like ho-humming through the last couple of events, you're not trying to be honest with yourself about how that's going. Semifinals, your career or your season is on the line, all the way down to 11th place in some of these places. So everyone's trying to get out every point.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where we even hear someone like Alexis Raptis, who's taking 2nd place at a semifinal, and she say, "I just came here to qualify. That was the objective. Anything beyond that is basically bonus." I mean, that's it. Fraser's talked about it during the peak of his career. Semifinal scares the shit out of me. That's the one weekend of the year that if something happens, whatever it is that's out of my control, that's it. I don't get the chance to go back and defend my title. So it was a very, very premium part of the season where there's a very real sense of do or die for the athletes. Look at some of the people who didn't make it this year. What about this, Lynn? I thought they were selecting athletes for the Rogue Invitational in the past based upon CrossFit Games placements. Obviously, a super fair question. If you look back at the CrossFit Games finishers compared to those that were invited to the Rogue Invitational, it's basically a mirror of the top athletes from the games. Barclay, how would you read into this? Is their system basically just a copy paste of the top 10 or 15 at the games? Or are they just getting lucky? Or can not both things be true?
Well, I go back to their second bullet point where they say historically we have selected a minimum of 10 athletes using this method. I mean, which one is it? Are you inviting just the top 10 plus athletes at the games, or are you actually inviting 10 athletes historically from this method? I haven't done the math, but I bet you that Yella Hosta, actually, I don't need to do the math. I can go to men's.
They probably did it for you already.
They probably did. Well, I also did it. I just don't have it pulled. Where's mine?
Let me pull up.
I'm scrambling. Okay, men. Jelly is in 23rd right now. Yella's in 23rd. So he would have gone from an invite to the Rogue Invitational last year. That's fine. I'm sure if we went through the list, we could find the 10 athletes that are in the top 10 that were invited to the semifinals, to the Rogue Invitational using their method. It's contradictory though, because it's either an invite or you're inviting people using this method. So just pick one or the other and stick with it, because they've given themselves a bailout by saying it's an invitational still when they have this qualifying system. We also don't know the order in which they invite people to this event. Do they first take 5 from the queue, then invite who they want, and then take the remaining 10 from the system? Do they start with this qualification system? The queue is the last thing to go, and then invites are right in the middle. We don't know the order of operations of how they're inviting people. But the bailout from it, and I hate saying bailout, but the bailout that they've given themselves by saying we reserve the right to invite whoever they want, should be the only line that they have to put out, because it's an invitational. It's in the name that it's an invitational, and by name, by definition of that name, it should just be invite only, and they can invite whoever the heck they want. I understand the transparency given with this qualification system, saying you may think that this person should have gone, but we decided to invite this person using this system, using these finishes that they've had. Makes no difference in the end. I think they provided a little bit extra clarity that was not even necessary in the first place. So at the same time, I'm kind of knocking them for making things more complicated and rewarding them or praising them for being transparent.
Mike, I mean, your tag is known and knowable. Do you like the extra information?
I love the extra information. I fully agree with Barclay that I have to squint my eyes at it a little, and it's fuzzy math to try to say that they actually use this historically. Like, that second bullet point does stick out like a sore thumb, but like, just say it's a beta. Just say it's brand new. Don't try to stand on the fact that you've been using this. The only place I could see that they maybe used it was for Tia, but she's Tia, and it's an invitational, and she's a rogue athlete, and like, she's Tia. So like, you don't need any point system to put together the fact that you should, if Tia is available, you should invite her to your event. Like,
but that would still be by invite. That wouldn't be by the system anyway, so it doesn't even matter in that place
she's
anyway.
The top one on the system, and she didn't compete that year, so it kind of like starts to point the fact of like, we skipped over. I think it was Bethany Flores, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. We skipped over an athlete and we invited Tia instead. Okay, well, Tia's at the top of your ranking that you put out there. We don't know that this ranking existed last year. It might have. This might be what Katie and them have for doing this. But like, in both cases, I think if you compare the two, they are both just the outcome of what they might be looking for when they go and create one of these. If you want it to look like Pat Vellner, who won the Rogue Invitational, is first, and you want it to look like Tia Claire Toomey, who is Tia Claire Toomey, is the top of the list, and she's a rogue athlete and all that stuff, and just her name alone, notoriety, like, you build a leaderboard that shows the outcome that you want. And then you, like, that's even like, if you're building anything, you probably build it with like, well, I expect this result, that it shows me this athlete is the best.
Didn't CrossFit do this? Didn't CrossFit basically say the same thing with the worldwide ranking system, that we basically decided that whoever was going to win the CrossFit Games had to be ranked number 1 in the system, and so we built the system to make sure that would happen.
Yes, it did, and it almost didn't happen. The only reason it actually didn't happen, that Jeff was first last year, and this annoys me because I wrote an article about it where it could have happened. The only reason it didn't happen is because of how Justin Medeiros did at the games this year. If he was within the podium area, he would be the number 1 on the worldwide ranking, and Jeff would still obviously be the fittest on earth for 2023.
And the reason for that is because there's no depreciation in their point system. So 10,000 points are available for this upcoming 2024 CrossFit Games, and the same 10,000 points is going to be rewarded to Jeff Adler for this year, for last year and this year from the 2023 CrossFit Games. There is no depreciation from year to year. So someone can get all their points and then do poorly at the games, where poorly is third place, as an example, and still be top of the board just because the person that won in the most recent year did worse than third in that prior year.
And I mean, obviously, it would be ideal situation to build a system with no bias in it.
Yep.
Is it possible to build a system with no bias in it?
I like to think that I did.
And I mean, look, and this is
I like Barclay's system.
I actually can vouch for that because of the conversations that you and I have had over the last 18 months or so that we've been working on that. And a lot of the objectives within those conversations are basically either me initiating it or you asking me, what's the problem? Where's the hole? Who's the outlier? What's the thing that I'm missing here? Am I double counting something? And trying to sift through and filter through those things. I would say that our beta testing of that system was last year at semifinals, where you were there for 2 of them on site, sitting with those guys from the broadcast team, not really adding something to the broadcast, but just offering, comparing, checking in with, making adjustments, having conversations afterwards, and refining the system that we'd already been working on. And now, and then at the games last year and this year at semifinals, there was a little bit more of an opportunity to share some of that data as we then found it to be meaningful and relevant based on the errors that we'd identified in the previous time period.
Yep. The one place that bias does exist, the one obvious place, I'm not going to say it's the only place, but one obvious place that bias does exist, and Halpin understood why it does exist the moment I gave him all the off-season competitions that the athletes have done for semifinals, was for each additional off-season competition that an athlete does, they get 10% less. There's a 10% depreciation. No, sorry. Yeah, the points for each additional semi or off-season competition are worth only 10%. So first competition is 100%, second competition is 10%, third competition is 1%, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there is a massive drop off there, but the bias had to exist in that sense, because without it, Karin Frey would be like third worldwide. And I like, the point of the system is to give a snapshot of what actually exists in the world right now in the sport of CrossFit, but it means nothing if no one like accepts it or believes in it. There's no backing from the community, and I did not believe that I would get backing from the community for that system if Karin Frey was like third worldwide.
So clearly Rogue has for good reason a lot of support and backing from the community. And do you think that this system is adding value to the competition and the competition structure that is a Rogue Invitational this year? Either one of you.
I don't know if it's adding to it. I think that
Barclay, finish your thought there.
I think that it's giving some sort of justification as to who they invite. Now, it could be a moot point, and the athletes that are in the top 10 are also the top 10 at the games. And then it's just, well, how did they get invited? Did they get invited through the qualifying system, or did they get invited as an invite? We don't really know. And I think that Rogue can kind of use the system and say, well, we used them. That was one of our 10 athletes that we used from the qualifying system. I don't really know if it adds much. I think it adds some transparency. I think it puts the ball in CrossFit's court to make some changes to their system, their worldwide rating system.
I agree with that. I think it does add value, and I'll start with Barclay's last point. CrossFit was the only one that put out anything, and again, CrossFit didn't even need to put that out. It's an interesting take. It allows me to post 280 men and 280 women stories and say they have a little rank next to their name, and it holds some truth to it, versus just me ranking them. And I would run out of ranking people by maybe number 50. So what it does add, adds competitive value. Rogue has now put out, hey, if we were to create a system using CrossFit's data, if we were to create a system similar to what Barclay did, here's how we would do it. We would look back 5 years. And Rogue, I think, makes sense to look back 5 years. There's a lot built on being a Rogue legend. There's a lot built on just historical value to the CrossFit space and things like that. Matt Fraser he's listed as inactive. If he was active, he would be invited based on his still points that he has from 2019 and on. So
But
I
does
think it adds
it?
a
But
lot.
in the case of Matt Fraser, if he was active again, would they even need to justify that invitation? I mean,
No, because it would be an invitation. He wouldn't go through the system anyways, which goes to Kiefer's point. How will it impact someone like Chandler or Noah, who's gone team now? It doesn't impact them at all because they still have guaranteed at least 5 invite spots for Chandler and or Noah and or anyone else that they can just invite regardless of their qualifying position.
Yeah, and I've gotten
already
that
seen it
team
happen.
question, so let me
We've already seen it.
go ahead.
We've already seen it happen with Annie Thorisdottir.
Yep.
Sorry, Halpin. Did I take your thought?
No, you're good. I was going to go another way. So again,
Go out of the way. Go.
It adds value. It adds value based on the fact that now Rogue, who's really the biggest name in CrossFit besides CrossFit themselves, has put out a ranking system that says, well, here's what we would do. We would look back 5 years. We would do things for Annie or Tia or team athletes or major injuries that just pop up or basically seemingly don't do step-ups correctly. No offense. We would sort of build a process that says like, well, hey, if you have an exception, we'll build an exception rule. We'll depreciate it over 5 years. We'll add an exception rule. We'll score events similarly. They're scoring CrossFit Games and Rogue the same. They're not trying to score their event more than the CrossFit Games. So they've created this system here. So when it comes to Noah and Chandler, or it comes to any team athlete that might be on this list, what they will get is an average of their last 3 years at that same event. So Noah's last 3 CrossFit Games would be averaged, and then Noah would get 15% less than that. And that seems like a bunch of math that you'd have to do over the top of your head. But if you want to look up Brooke Wells and then under that events drop down, only pick the invitational, I have an example that'll show basically what Noah and Chandler would look like here. So if you go to that and then go up to events drop down, and you can even search for Brooke, but just do Rogue Invitational. They say Rogue events, but there's really only one Rogue event, so it's kind of funny that way. But so pop quiz, if anyone knows, or you saw my post earlier, how many Rogue Invitationals has Brooke Wells done?
2.
That's correct.
Thank
And
you.
when were those Rogue Invitationals that she did?
19 and 20.
The online for sure.
Brooke Wells has received 5 years worth of Rogue Invitational points. That puts her 10th just on Rogue Invitational points alone. And she's 10th only by like a couple hundred points. So if you go to 2023 Rogue Invitational, she will still be on that list. So they build points for athletes that maybe they were injured, and Brooke has been, obviously. Yeah, there she is, number 20. So that points right there. Obviously, she wasn't there. That's her 3-year average. And those 3 years aren't even ones where she was also there. They're averaging points that they just averaged the year before, minus a 15% depreciation on those. So again, a whole bunch of math. But
how did you find
the
that?
process? Well, here's a funny story of me and Barclay, basically, and who we are. We both were in a space race to try to put out our own version of this.
And we both
reverse
succeeded.
engineering it. And I was only held back because Barclay is the sole owner, seemingly.
That's true.
Of
my
2019.
generosity invited Halpin into the space race.
I owe my entire career in reverse engineering this to Barclay Dale. So
Quoted.
I only could see the full 20 ranking based on what Barclay gave me because it just doesn't exist anywhere else publicly. So
is this the Rogue Invitational 2019? You mean?
And 2020.
Yeah. And 2020.
And maybe 2021 now.
There's even some articles on Morning Chocolate that Patrick Clark wrote about the Rogue Invitational. It only says the top 10. Sorry, Patrick.
Wow, PC.
Wait, but Mike, I thought don't you have
I don't
access to
remember
the
that.
document I have with this?
No, I don't have that one.
Yes, you do. I just checked.
I have a lot of.
Here's
I have a
the
lot of
point, Brian.
documents.
It's that it's not public. It's not made public currently by Rogue itself. There are other people like myself, like you, like
Fran Long, Data Wad.
thank you, that have the information, that have it privately, that can make it public, but it's no longer available by the source itself.
Again, yeah.
Okay.
So with that, that leads us back to Brooke Wells. Is you then there's, and I think Rogue is actually going to call this out somehow because I pointed it out to him. There's nothing that says one of these scores was an exception. So like you just have to know, wait, Brooke Wells is getting points for an event that she wasn't at. So that means she had to have an exception. So that's the only way I found Brooke Wells getting 5 years worth of Rogue Invitational. And she only did 2, and the 2 were, one was online. The same goes for Tia. The same goes for Annie. The only male athlete that has an exception is Ricky Gerard for the 2023 games.
Did you use this, Mike?
I made that. Yeah.
And this is what you used in your little space race?
It is. This is actually the only thing I was able to put out while Barclay was putting out the whole thing, was that I created a points table that you should use.
Yeah, you can take back over, Patrick.
Oh, yeah.
What about this question? What about this question?
Wait.
Lynn, isn't having both the Rogue and the games included in their system double counting for the top athletes? Barclay?
Yep. Yes, it is. But it doesn't have to as much anymore, because historically they take the top athletes at the games who have performed the best at the games, and therefore they get another opportunity to perform well at the Rogue Invitational. So they get double rewarded for that. But under this system, someone can get points elsewhere. Not very many points, but they can get points elsewhere in the Open, in the quarterfinals, that can jump them up the leaderboard and therefore be not invited, earn a spot through this qualifying system, and therefore get points only once for Rogue. So if someone gets 21st at the games, they don't get points for the games. Only the top 20 athletes in any competition here get points. But if they somehow weasel their way into a spot on the qualifying system that allows them to get invited through that, then they only get single rewarded. But yes, majority of athletes, if not all of them, are going to get double points, and therefore the top will remain the top for a long, long time.
In both of these systems, how relevant is the Open and quarterfinals?
Not relevant. Only the top 20, as Barclay just said, for the Open, and only the top 20 for quarterfinals are given any points, and it's a sliding scale. So the most you can get for the Open is 250 points. The most you can get for quarterfinals is 500 points, and that is for Rogue.
So I can win the Open and get less points than Brooke Wells gets, or no, only get 250 points, and she can get 150 points for not even showing up to the Rogue Invitational. And we're talking about
break your elbow.
Hey, 250 looks pretty good for some of these athletes, though.
It does, yeah. And then CrossFit basically has the opposite issue. They give points to everybody, so in effect, no one gets points for that point. Like you get 1,000 points for winning the Open, you get 2,000 points for quarterfinals, but then the next person down gets 990. So
the Open is more relevant in the Rogue Invitational system than the current World Ranking system.
Yes.
Yes.
Apparently, because Miro,
and it's very relevant. Yeah.
All of her points are coming from the Open.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts her 43rd, which is, not that bad. It's only behind an athlete who hasn't competed for the last 2 years.
Yeah, but look who she's in
Maybe
front of.
Points.
Yep.
Grace Walton. What? She's in because Grace gets no credit for doing well at semifinals.
Yep.
Let me ask you guys this: Does this Rogue ranking system help give us any insight into who could potentially be competing at the Rogue Invitational this year in terms of not actual names of people or a kind of athlete or the total number of participants?
Total number of participants is an interesting question now with all of this, but not. It's only the same names we would have thought of in the first place. Like if you go, there's an immediate reaction from quite a few coaches and athletes on Rogue's announcement of this, and it really sort of pinpoints the issue here. And I think I got a few questions on my Instagram as well. It's like, what does this do to rookie athletes, or sort of like athletes that just don't have 5 years worth of data, or the Open never mattered. Quarterfinals was really just in their region as far as mattering. They haven't been to the games yet, or they were never invited to Rogue Invitational, so their points sit basically at 0. Like, you're not going to see some of those athletes jump on, like an Alex Gazan, who I think Justin Tyler was speaking up for in a comment that he made to Rogue about it. Is you're not going to see them jump up into a seemingly qualifying spot for the Rogue Invitational. But then you have to look at how many, like you just said, how many athletes they're inviting. Historically, it's only 20. And they also still state that they have the queue, which you would assume is 5 athletes. Mm-hmm. So maybe top 15. But to crack the top 15, you basically have to be an athlete that's been going to the games and invited to the Rogue Invitational for the majority of those 5 years. Like, you're not cracking anywhere because just the points aren't there. Like, you would have had to have won the Open the last couple of years, won quarterfinals the last couple of years, and then not made the games to like be an exception to what I just said.
So you would have had to done what Jonakoski did this year, potentially 2 years in a row, but also not have a pedigree prior to that.
Yeah, just set the world on fire online. Yeah,
online. Barclay, anything to add in terms of insights that it gives us to this year's Rogue Invitational?
Expect them to use this system when it's advantageous for them, for athletes that have been invited, saying that they made it through using the qualifying system, and where it is not in their best interest to say that it was through the qualification system that an athlete made it to the Rogue Invitational, expect them to say that it was an invited athlete.
All right. And I think that kind of summarizes what the Rogue Invitational's ranking system is and what we know about it. 4 relevant stages of the season. For them, Open, quarterfinals, games, and Rogue. 5-year look back, depreciating value. Generally, does filter the best athletes towards the top, but pretty much all these systems are designed to do that. It allows for athletes specifically who have to miss time of competing to retain some of their previous accomplishments a little bit more than the previous system because of the look back being a longer window. Fair enough?
Yep.
Yeah, I think so. If you want to leave this one on the screen, I honestly am curious, and I'll obviously do the math here. If Rogue's system would be better used by CrossFit, and if CrossFit's system would be better used by Rogue. And I say that because with a 5-year look back, you could do a little bit more to say, like, hey, how did some of these regions do online? And appreciation value and things like that. And then with a 2-year look back, hey, who are really the best athletes and who should we be inviting to a single event a year? So, yeah.
Yeah, so that was kind of the last place I wanted to go here, is that you put this comparison kind of post up. I don't know that it's necessarily a pros and a cons. It's just kind of putting the two up there next to each other for people to get some context relative to them. So after going through both of these systems here and doing this post, what would you say are like 2 or 3 things that people should take away from these little updates that we've seen to the worldwide ranking and this new introduction to the Rogue ranking system last week?
I would say, from what I've seen, Rogue has a lot of push or pull in the maybe both CrossFit space. It's quite the nudge to say, hey, we have this ranking system too, and it does all the things that yours doesn't do, to see if that actually pushes the CrossFit team to say, oh, well, maybe that is a good way to appreciate value in events, or maybe we should have exceptions when it comes to certain things, because athletes have real lives and have real injuries and have real reasons to join a team or do other things and maybe do the best thing for them. I think there's places there, but I also think Rogues is seemingly like the antithesis almost of the other one, where it's like, well, we're going to do everything completely opposite, and you sort of have this like Coke versus Pepsi thing where it's like, oh, well, we need to show our brand completely different. Anyway, I won't go down that road, but I think there's value in both. But I think the most value is actually in them speaking up and saying maybe they did use this historically, they'd never shown it to anybody, but maybe they have reason to if they were to try to push CrossFit in a direction that might help them.
So in conclusion, Sunday night at 7 o'clock, Starbucks is very busy, but 6:30 and 7:30, it's not.
It's way less
And
busy right now.
Barclay, what would you add, supplement or change to that in terms of, these two things side by side?
The thing that stuck out about Halpin's comment was, he wasn't saying it literally. He said, Rogue system is everything that CrossFit's is not. And I think that the opposite is also true. CrossFit system is everything that Rogue is not. I mean, you've only got less than 100 women on the active leaderboard for Rogue. So you can't even use the system in its current state to do the top 100, to do the DeHunt method for semifinal and games allocations at the semifinal. So a middle ground between the two systems has to exist. Neither system is perfect. In fact, one of them has admitted that it is a beta system, and one of them makes changes and then tells us about them whenever they want. So we have transparency from one in a system that at the moment can't be used to qualify athletes for the game. And we don't really have much transparency, not no transparency, but not much transparency from another system that does not reward athletes for anything that occurs in the offseason, does not have any depreciation over years, and does not have any sort of differentiation between the open and quarterfinals in terms of points for those top athletes that are going to make a run at being in that top 100.
And yet the system that you created and that I've kind of consulted with you on over the past couple of years addresses all of those things that are missing from those systems.
Well, of course, I'm going to be biased towards my system because it's my system. But yeah, that was the point. The point is, let's take all the information that we can, anything that exists, let's put it all into one system rather than picking and choosing what we see fit and seeing what the result is. Tia was like a 92 in my rating of 0 to 99, and people were pretty dissatisfied with that. I think she's back up to a 95 right now. I've added in the semifinals finishes. I will be posting the updates to those rankings this week on Instagram. But I mean, she's already climbing, and she got points back for the Rogue 2023. So yes.
Have you yet, or will you be putting these three ranking systems side by side anywhere for people to see the small changes within the top, 50 or so in the world?
I can. You can add it to my to-do list. I have not considered it, but I have had a couple athletes reach out and put in my DMs. I like your system more because I'm ranked higher, and honestly, I understand it.
Well, I mean, the thing about designing the system is that variable, we take that out of the equation, right? We don't care who ends up getting ranked where based on a name. We care who ends up getting where based on what they've done,
performance
during the periods of time and against the athletes that they've competed against that we're evaluating. So I do think that it's good, something that Patrick and I in general, to have these kind of conversations, to have these kind of systems, to be identifying that there are ways to accumulate points and to represent athlete excellency or ranking of the athletes based on their performances. Patrick and I sometimes have talked about with regards to, for example, the spin media poll as compared to a worldwide ranking system, that in other sports, there's a variety of different ways to rank teams or athletes, and that those things can coexist. Do you feel like that's also possible with CrossFit where we're at right now, or would it be better if everyone got on the same page?
I mean, one system would be better because then we have some direction, but also you grow and adapt with adversity. And adversity in this case is battling ideas, which are the worldwide ranking system, Rogue system. I'm calling mine the strength of field rating system. So all these different, not that I'm anywhere in the mix with those two systems, but like all these competing ideas create growth, and ideally they create one direction that we can follow. I think that we're getting to a place where we have the tools to have the sport go in one direction rather than people going separate directions. It's just a matter of people agreeing and deciding that we need pieces from this system and pieces from this system. We're going to make one system, and it'll be the Rogue CrossFit World Wide ranking system, as an example.
Mike?
Oh, sorry. It's still bad here. But I want to say this. I put it in the chat. I wrote it wrong the first time. But if Dubai or Wadapalooza suddenly wanted to release a ranking system, they should talk to Barclay Dale. Because his, honestly, like looks at all the things and actually says like, yeah, this athlete's better than this other one, without trying to say, hey, our event is the best and everyone else is the worst, or our event is equal grounds to the games. I wouldn't say Rogue is equal grounds to the games, honestly. They obviously invite people from the games, so you kind of have to look at it that way. But every event is going to look at it and be like, well, our event is the best. All that being said, I think to Barclay's point, minus all the background noise here, what I'll say is this is all it really does, is it just becomes a measuring contest of like, hey, look what we can do too. And that's really what makes change happen. Like everybody could have their own ranking system, and everybody could have a qualifier, and everybody could have a season long of opens and whatever else to find the fittest. If you're going to put something out there, all you're really doing is saying like, hey, CrossFit, why don't you do it this way? That's all I got out of Rogue, actually saying like, historically, we've invited 10 people out of this system. That's like, well, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but putting it out there does a lot. And then it allows people to actually say like, okay, well, is that the right way?
Patrick, you've worked with ESPN in the past, and you've seen a lot of rankings for different, sports leagues, whatever. You've listened here very patiently to these guys for a while. From your, background with that and exposure to a lot of different sports, and seeing these kind of changes in the CrossFit space with more ranking systems coming out from important entities in the space. What are your observations?
Well, if we want to pull back on my experience, like from ESPN, my roommate when I was at ESPN, he was basically if you guys remember the BCS system where they had points, he was the guru for that. Like he was the one that was coming out, putting out
Schwab.
The Schwab, R.I.P. Schwab. But his name was Brad Edwards. If you Google him, I don't think long there, but he was the guy that kind of would dumb down. Like everyone said, oh, the BCS system, and he would be like what Barclay and Mike would do. He would kind of put it in layman's terms, try to put the information out there to kind of explain it. But every year it got tweaked to BCS. So Brad was every year having a new system or how they would improve it, whether it be a beta all the way to then. And then, then finally they got rid of the whole BCS. They started the playoffs, but even now they still have rankings about who goes in the playoffs. These committees and stuff like that. I think someone put it in the chat earlier. I forgot who it was, but something, I think it was CrossFat, regarding, having a selection committee. I could definitely see that in the future at some point, just to make things easier. Now, granted, even if you have a committee, you're going to have, the thing about having humans is that anytime you have humans in a committee, you're always going to have biases. That's why these rankings, people don't like the rankings because they don't understand it, or thanks. Yeah, I think this is, kind of golf is going through something similar with their ranking system, but I think what golf does is they just grab raw data. They just put, it's fairly simple. They're not grabbing percentages. They're not grabbing hundreds of a point. What they're doing is grabbing best finishes, and how, so you can have a golfer who, is probably has no top 20s, but he plays in every golf tournament possible, he'll be ranked higher than some of the guys who traditionally do top 20s. And that's what I like to see. Something where it rewards longevity, and it's still it's true. It's true. It's a Mac. It's the first Mac. It's the first. That's a Mac. Yeah. But
right. So there's there's
Yeah,
growing pains
I
for
mean-
these things in all different sports. I think that in general, it's positive that these things are happening, that these conversations
Yes.
are happening. People are putting these things out there. I do think that, as Barclay said, there's some room for maybe some refinement, some collaboration. That because one of the challenges with CrossFit in general is that it's not as predictable as most other sports. In golf, at least you know that every time they show up there are 18 holes. Whoever puts the ball from the tee into the hole in the least number of strokes over the tournament is going to win the tournament. That never changes.
Yeah.
In CrossFit, we have all these different variables. So when we have an opportunity for something to be consistent, it seems like there's some value in leaning into that, whether it's movement standards, whether it's the length, the 4 stages of the season, whether it's the number of workouts at a stage of the season. But these small variables that are always constantly changing, just adding more and more layers of that is really making it difficult for people who are just learning about this sport, I would think. And so these kinds of the negative, if I see one from these types of things, is that it becomes even more and more limiting. I mean, this conversation we're having tonight, we understand it. There's the people that are listening get it. They're curious. They're asking good questions. But if you're just coming into the CrossFit space on the heels of a very exciting semifinal, for whatever reason, someone at your affiliate went there, told you about it, invited you to it, asked you to watch it with them, and then you see these things coming out and this conversation on the back end of it, how helpful is it right now as the sport is still trying to find its identity and grow in terms of reeling in a new audience?
I think at the end of the day, we need to do, because the biggest, where you have a lot of people arguing about like who's going to Rogue, it's usually in those last couple spots, and people want their favorites, the Tias, the Annies. I mean, I think we need to approach it as an invitational, as an all-star game. You put the most popular athletes and have the people vote on, just like the Major League Baseball, NFL, have them vote on it, because that's ultimately what's going to drive numbers for any sport, especially if you're televising it or if you're creating content, is the popular athlete. So make it a popularity contest, and then you use the Q to award athletes for their merits. Because that's what Major League Baseball does. They, you vote for your team, and then they grab some other additional players that aren't getting votes but having great seasons, and then they let the fans vote them in, or the players or the coaches get the bull.
Well, this is actually a great point. Let me throw this at you, Barclay. I don't think there was anyone that was really concerned with the qualification process for Rogue before this.
Nope, I would agree.
Nope.
I didn't care. It all made sense who went to Rogue Invitational. I didn't care too much. I mean, I totally understand the why isn't Bethany Flores here? Totally understand why Tia Claire Toomey was there. It makes sense both ways.
Yeah.
And we're going back to a point that I made way at the beginning, was they made it more complex, which I'm going to knock them for, but they also were extremely transparent about it, which I'm going to reward them for.
So you're just
Not even.
Right?
I'm in the middle the whole time.
In the middle. It's like, yeah. I mean, I totally agree. It's like,
it will be interesting also because in the context of all of this, we have the Tier Cup coming up.
Yep.
And there's clearly going to be a process for qualifying, inviting some combination of athletes at a very premium level to participate in that. And Mike, I know you were talking about Wadapalooza and Dubai potentially asking for some information. Those are actually competitions that have consulted me and Barclay in the past with regards to certain things. And so they are out there and aware of people like us doing these types of studies that have been doing them for years and years now. I mean, collectively between the three of us, I would say we've been doing some kind of ranking systems for close to 15 years worth of research. I'm probably in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 years. Barclay's probably got 4 or 5. Mike's got 2, 3, 4, maybe 3, something like that. So it adds up. And clearly you see how much detail these guys put into it, how quick they are on the draw to be able to evaluate these things in relatively small amount of time. So anyway, last thoughts? Anyone with last thoughts about the conversation? Mike, Barclay?
I'm good.
Let me ask the kid next to me at the Starbucks real quick for his last thoughts. Hold on.
His mind's so blown right now. He's like, "What the hell?"
It's the new CK
They
guy.
didn't expect that.
This is actually, I mean, kind of a good fun one to have at the end. Woof, fan votes go up. The rookies won't get any love. I disagree with that. I mean, think about people this year that we were talking about: Bill Leahy's, Victor Hoffers, Austin Hatfield's,
Grace
Taylor
Walton.
Self type people, Grace Walton, Julia Hannaford didn't make it, but these people that coming into that part of the season were already getting a lot of fanfare, attention, and people talking about their potential. And most of those athletes did very well and ended up earning it on their own. But I do think that there would be the potential for some lesser known athletes to still get some attention from the fans.
Could you imagine if they had a fan vote for one spot? They allocated 19 in some capacity, and they had a fan vote for, like, people talk about. I was a swimmer, so this is why this is my example. But people talk about in an Olympics for swimming, there's technically 12 lanes. Or 10 lanes, and lane 0 and lane 10 are empty, and people swim in lanes 1 through 9.
Yeah.
And we should just put an average swimmer in those outside lanes so we actually understand how fast they're going. That could be what that fan vote is. Now, it could be some
or Michael Phelps every year just to see how much he's deteriorated or not.
Like, imagine if we got Saquon Barkley to get that fan vote and be that 20th athlete at the games, and people talk about
the Rogue Invitational.
For the Rogue Invitational, to get them to the Rogue Invitational and actually compete against these CrossFitters, like, that would be really cool.
Yeah, Dubai tried to do something similar. It's not quite the same, but they invited Hunter McIntyre last year.
Yep.
And that was like, I think that would have been a huge success. Hunter asked him to do that. They gave him the invite. He didn't come. But there's a why not reach into a different realm? Just put it out there and see if someone like that would want to show up.
Yeah. Cool.
And I guess that's a good summary for all of this. CrossFit even can do the same thing. Their rule book, I mean, they're obviously a privately owned entity. They're a private sport. There's no governing body over them. They put out this ranking. They try to say that it is finding the best regions and allocating spots and all that. Their rule book at the bottom of it basically just ends with, hey, we can do whatever we want.
At CrossFit, sole discretion is the language.
Yeah. They have invited Hunter McIntyre in 2019 to compete. He competed. He only got through 2 events.
And Ben Smith too.
But yeah, and Ben Smith in that year, which always gives the little asterisk that I know Brian loves. So
everyone was really pointing it out this year when they were talking about the fact that BKG and then Cole Sager actually qualified. That was the key word for 11 consecutive years, because Ben Smith competed for 11 consecutive years, but did not qualify in his 11th year.
So I really do appreciate these ranking systems. Barclay and I can do the space race, and we can try to back into it. We can do all of these things, and we can sit here for an hour and a half and talk about it. They can do whatever they want. They could invite whoever they want. They could say that these are the 40 fittest athletes on the field. We'll always say, well, it's the 40 fittest that qualified through the system that they created. Rogue can invite whoever they want. It will be maybe a mix of all the things, but it's purely an invitational. And all that to be said, I think there's a ranking system out there that can actually look and assess a field. I think Barclays is the best I've seen. And I think people should recognize that people are trying from outside in to inform some of these decisions, or at least inform, like, hey, why don't you try it this way? And that's what I really appreciate about Rogues, is they're big enough to actually say, hey, we're going to try it this way and see what happens. We're going to put it out there. We're going to call it a beta. We're going to be as transparent as we want to be. Still just invite Tia, basically, or Annie again this year. I'd love to see that. And then see what happens. But, like, they could do whatever they want.
I think there's a very real possibility that Annie gets an invite to Rogue this year. Not even a far trip for her.
Yeah. And another, I can see a possibility of another Rogue, a newly crowned Rogue athlete, Tyson Bagent, getting an invite. There you go, Barclay. You get your, if it wasn't during football season.
So cool.
If it wasn't during football season, I mean, he's a Rogue athlete.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's I think that's a great overview.
They can do what they want.
I appreciate you guys who are here, obviously watching, and Mike and Barclay specifically for taking the time on a Sunday to do this, especially Mike. I think he's on a family vacation, taking some time from the family to come and share the insights here. I did appreciate the comment from V about, just being able to appreciate the sport for what it is and not necessarily need all that stuff. And for some people, and a lot of people, that's the case, which is cool. I think that competitions, coaches, athletes, analysts, media are often asking these questions of how do I get opportunities? How do I get recognition? What is actually valuable in this sport? And for the people that are really heavily invested in it, from just a kind of a nerdy fan perspective to a real financial considerations in their life with their clients, etc. That did I just click on this, or did you click on this, Patrick?
I clicked on it. Sorry.
Okay, that there's some value there. No, that's fine. So thanks for the conversation. We will have some podcasts throughout this week as we start to talk to some of the CrossFit Games athletes. Paige Simmons is coming on tomorrow. Victor Hoff or Amy Kringle will be on later this week. Harry Lightfoot is TBD for Thursday. He told me that he may not be able to do it, but then he shared it in his story. So we'll see. But if not, we'll try to find someone else. So some conversations with athletes coming up this week. We may also pop on Wednesday, see if we can get Bella on here and just kind of catch up on some other stuff. And then the next competition we'll have is going to be Fittest of the Coast or Fittest of South Carolina, in South Carolina 2 weekends from now. And we got Reps Ahead Pro 3 at the end of the month. So be on the lookout for some stuff about that. Barclay should have got some stuff from me about those competitions today.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you guys. Great to see you, everybody. And Patrick, you want to close us out?
Yeah. Thanks as always to HGR CBD for the support. Use friend 20 to receive 20% off all your products as you need. But with that being said, thanks a lot, guys, for showing. Sorry I was late. Traffic and Army, priority. But thanks everyone for in the chat. Again, we appreciate your Sunday. You taking your times on your Sunday. We appreciate that, and that's what makes you the best fans in the sport. And we definitely appreciate that. I found this very informative. That's good. That's what we're here to inform. So with that being said, hey, be friendly, our friends.